Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to today's event. Sorry for starting a couple of minutes late, but we're glad that you're all here. Before we begin, here are a few housekeeping guidelines. Please write, if you have any questions for the panel, please write the questions in the Q&A box and it will be addressed at the end of the session. And for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, welcome. And if you have a question, please add it there and we'll share it with our panelists. It is our pleasure at Sarmaya to collaborate with the Museum Rietberg in Zurich and bring this event to you. We have a special and long-running relationship with the Museum Rietberg. Most recently, Paul Abraham, who's the founder at Sarmaya, was invited to the Rietberg to share a project which is very special to us, Isa Nama. So really, we'd like to thank Johannes Belz, who's the Deputy Director at Museum Rietberg, for your support, for your encouragement, and for really making this possible. So thank you. It's also wonderful to see that we have people joining us from across the world, from Switzerland, from Singapore, and from India. And so thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by introducing our brilliant panelists for the evening. We have Johannes Belz, who's the Deputy Director and Curator of South and Southeast Asian Art at Museum Rietberg. He also studied theology, Indian studies, and religious studies, and has traveled to undertake research in India numerous times. We have Eva von Rumont, who's an independent curator and researcher with the Museum Rietberg. Since 2014, she has spent time researching and studying Javanese shadow theater and is co-curator of the exhibition Javanese shadow puppetry at the Museum Rietberg. We have Paul Abraham, who is an art patron, collector, and founder of Sarmaya Arts Foundation. Paul works closely with Indian artists to encourage innovation in indigenous art forms like Matani Pachedi, Tholu Bommalaata, Mithila, and Bengal Patua. They will all be in conversation with Manju Sara Rajan, journalist, editor, and arts manager. She's the editor-in-chief of beautifulhomes.com. She's also a contributing editor for Vogue and the former CEO of the Kochi Biennale Foundation. So before we get to the conversation, we'd like to take you on a little journey to witness an award-winning master performer and puppeteer, Shinde Chidambara Rao, in Dharmavaram in southern India, and his practice of a form of shadow puppetry, Tolu Bomalata. This is our first film at Sarmaya and a labor of love, and reflects our commitment to highlighting living traditions and art forms from the Indian subcontinent. So give me a couple of seconds while I pull up the film. Sorry about that. Sorry, there has to be a technical glitch. Sorry, just give me a second. Okay, here we go.
Gajanana Maharnisha Anekadantam Bhaktana Ekadantamupasmahe Ekadantamupasmahe. పురుషుడు తిరుక్కోకుంటే ఎక్కడెక్కడ ఏమేమి ఉంది అనేది ఒక కళాకారుడు తిరిగినంత వాడు ఎంత తిరుగుతాడో వానికి అన్ని ఐడియాలు వచ్చేస్తాయి అనే భావంతో అక్కడక్కడ ఎక్కడ పోయినా కూడా ఒక మనం దావతో నడిచేటప్పుడు కూడా ఎక్కడ సిటీలకు కానీ ఎక్కడ టౌన్లకు కానీ పోయినప్పుడు కూడా
I think what's unique about Chidambara is the fact that he blends a certain psyche, a certain state of happiness along with the knowledge and the physical attributes required to be a performer.
రవి ఎరుగున్న చోట కవి ఎరుగును అని సూర్యుడు సోకని జాగాలో కూడా కవీశ్వరుడు. అతని తర్వాత ఒక పాట పాడేటప్పుడు కూడా స్వరాన్ని ఏ రాగంలో తిలకిస్తా ఈయన ఇంట ఐడియా చేసి కొత్త కొత్త రకాలుగా అట్లా మార్పులు చేసుకుంటూ వస్తాం.
First time I met Chidambra Rao was in a transactional context. The man and his wife were actually behind a counter. I didn't know them, they didn't know me, and we kind of talked about potentially acquiring one or two works. The good thing, of course, was that his works were exquisite.
నేను పురాతన అయిన కళ ఇది తోలు బొమ్మలు అంటే ఆ ఆర్ట్ స్టైలే వేరు. మా తాత ముత్తాత కాలం నుండి కూడా ఆ మహారాష్ట్ర నుండి ఆంధ్ర రాష్ట్రానికి, కర్ణాటక రాష్ట్రానికి, తమిళనాడు, కేరళ, ఇట్లా ఒరిస్సా.
So it's a story of migration, it's a story of displacement maybe. It's a story of how as each community moved on, they kind of evolved the art. So there's a Karnataka version of Tolu Bomalata, there's a Tamil version, there's a Telugu version, there is a, in terms of the puppets. So I think that in that context, it's very interesting to see how a social group transforms itself over the years and, makes some distant land home.
ఆ దైవాధీనంతో ఎవరో ఒక మహనీయుడు ఇట్లా ఏదన్నా ఒక నాటకం మాదిరి ఒక పల్లెల్లో కూడా వాళ్లకు ఒక అట్రాక్షన్గా చూపించేదానికి ఏదన్నా ఒక అవకాశం ఉండేటట్లా జీవనానికి ఇది చేసుకోండి అని పెద్దలు ఎవరో చెప్పిన వలన వాళ్ళు దాన్ని ఫాలో అయ్యి ఇట్లా అందరూ కలిసి నాటకాలు పల్లెల మీద పోవడము జీవనం చేసుకుంటా ఉండ్రి.
సాధుతూ నీవేల తన మేల ఇంజీవరాక్షి నా బాహుబలి మికి నరులెంత వారే అడవులు ఆకులములు తిని పడియున్న హీనమానవుని పొందేల గోరెదవు పొలకి నంపొంది.
తోలు బొమ్మలాట ఆడేటప్పుడు మా అమ్మ మా నాయన కథ చెప్పేవాళ్ళు. ఆ విధంగా చెప్పి వాళ్ళ మనసును అనేది కరిగించి మాటల్లోనే కరిగింది. నా భార్య నాసరింగా బొమ్మలు తయారు చేసేవాళ్ళు. నాసరింగ్ కూడా మా వాళ్ళు సహాయం ప్రతి పనిలో కూడా నాసరింగా చర్మం కడిగేటప్పుడు జతకు ఒక నిమిషం కూడా ఇడిసి పక్కన ఉండదు. తర్వాత చర్మం అంతా పోయి ఒక మంచం ప్రేమకు కట్టి ఒక 2 రోజులు బయట ఎండకు అది బాగా ఆరే వరకు ఆరి బాగా మంచి ట్రాన్స్పరెంట్ వచ్చేదానికి బాగా మన అద్దం మాదిరి తయారయ్యేంత వరకు పెట్టేస్తాము. మళ్ళా అన్నీ ఇప్పుకొని వచ్చి నేను స్కెచ్ వేసి చాక్ పీస్తో స్కెచ్ వేసి మనకు ఏ కథకు ఏమి బొమ్మ కావాలా అనే భావంతో నేను స్కెచ్ చేసి తర్వాత ఈ సూదితో మనం చాక్ పీస్ వేస్తానే మళ్ళీ మనం చేయబెట్టి రాసేదానికి అది మాసిపోతుంది. మళ్ళీ దానికి ఇంకా ఏది అంటదు. ఇచ్చిన తర్వాత ఒక మంచి షార్ప్ బ్లేడ్తో అంతా నీట్గా క్లీన్ చేస్తే బాగా పాలిష్ మాదిరి వస్తుంది. తర్వాత ఈ ఎదురు చెట్టు బుంగ ఉంటుంది, దాని దెబ్బతో మనము ఇది చేసుకుని పెన్ను మాదిరి తయారు చేసుకొని దాంతో బ్లాకు లైనింగ్ ఎక్కడెక్కడ ఏమేమి డిజైన్ వేయాలా ఇంకా తర్వాత నా భార్య దాన్ని ఎక్కడెక్కడ ఏం డిజైన్ హోల్స్ కటింగ్ చేయాలా అదంతా నేను చెప్పే పని లేదు.
I think modern and contemporary art is about individuals, and in many of our traditional art forms in India, it's familial. It is a family or an extended group in the local community that comes together to make the art happen. The intimacy that is created within the family context when somebody is trained to sing, somebody is trained to make the puppet, somebody is trained to manipulate the puppet, and when it all comes together on the night that you perform, it's very special, and it bonds them together.
తోలు బొమ్మలాట ఒక 20-25 సంవత్సరాల కిందట 25-30 సంవత్సరాల కిందట పల్లెల్లో బాగా చూసేవాళ్ళు. ఇలాంటివి పల్లెల్లో చాలా ఒక జానపద కళలంటే చాలా మక్కువతో చూసేవాళ్ళు. ముందు మా అమ్మ మా నాన్న కాలంలో తోలు బొమ్మలాటే ఆడే గ్రూపులు దాదాపు మా ఆంధ్ర రాష్ట్రంలోనే 180 గ్రూపులు ఉండేది. ఇప్పుడు పరిస్థితి ఏమైందంటే టెలివిజన్లు వచ్చి కొత్త కొత్త సినిమాలు, టీవీలు, వీడియోలు, తర్వాత ఈ సెల్లులు, ఇప్పుడు నాటకాలు చాలా తగ్గిపోయినాయి. దాంట్లో ఒక ఆకర్షించుకోవాలంటే ఆడియన్స్కి ఆకర్షించుకోవాలంటే ఎక్కువ కామెడీ ఎక్కువ. ఇప్పుడు లేకుంటే మామూలు రామాయణము మామూలు విన్నాము, ఏదన్నా ఇది వేయండి, ఏదన్నా జోక్ వేయండి.
There comes a time when you are also thinking what next, and I think right now not just Tholu Bomalata, many other craft forms are facing that existential crisis about where are we headed with this. What is fundamental to my engagement with them is to try and see if there is a possibility to leave them with a little more sense of security and confidence, so that they can practice this without worrying about what will put food on the table tomorrow. It's a very deep tradition that probably has hundreds of years of evolution behind it. It's a special privilege for us in this country to be aware and to be secure in the knowledge that all of this richness is what we can call ours, and that adds so much to our quality of life, let's put it that way. And I think if we lose it, then we lose so much.
So I hope you enjoyed that. Next, we're going to travel to Zurich. So the Museum Rietberg recently opened an exhibition on Javanese shadow theater called Stories of Life and the World. And we're very privileged that Johannes recorded a video of a guide to the putting together and curating of the exhibition. And we're going to show you that right now. Sorry, I'm not having a good. Yes, hoping this works.
My name is Johannes Belz. I'm the Vice Director and Curator of South and Southeast Asian art at the Museum Rietberg. Being a curator means that I look after my collections, that I do research, and we realize special exhibitions. One of my favorite activities and what I really like to do is initiating and realizing cooperation projects with our partners in India. A few years back, the Museum Rietberg received a superb collection of shadow puppets from Java. And we decided to dedicate an exhibition to this particular theme. And while doing research and while preparing the exhibition, I became very much aware of the similarities and this theater tradition has and shares with other puppet theater traditions all over Asia. And when I talked to Paul Abraham about this exhibition, he sent me immediately documentation, a video, a film he made about shadow theater in South India. And we both found that it would be very interesting to explore this common ground and the similarities and differences, and what it fascinated both of us is, in fact, that in India and in Java, this theater tradition, the shadow puppets, is today a very lively theater tradition, and it's performed, it's full of life, and it's experimenting, and new influences and new stories enter these theater traditions. And so we became very excited and wanted to initiate a kind of discussion and a roundtable talk about this theme. I would like to take you through the exhibition in a little tour now. What we want to show in this exhibition, and what we try to implement and to show through its design and the text, the labels, and the setting, the architecture, is that the shadow theater in Java is a very complex cultural tradition, and it's the performance, it's the music, it's the actors, it's the players, it's the artist who makes the puppets, and it's the storytelling. So it's a accumulation and a mixture of many arts, and this is, I think, something very fascinating. And the second point I want to make here is, and what our audiences should understand, is that this art is still alive. It's not that these figures are ancient and beautiful and dead. No, this theater tradition is part of the cultural life in Java today. And we try to build a bridge between the ancient puppets, the ancient tradition, and the contemporary Java, and bringing in these videos and having like little windows where you can see how a performance is done and how people gather to go to a theater, and you learn something about the puppet making, etc., etc. What I think is really interesting is to compare these shadow puppets from Java to the shadow puppets from India. And it's very interesting and intriguing if you look at one of these figures, how with how much details they are decorated. And you can see the way they move and the body posture, the face, the nose, and the gentle movement of the hands. You can see the character of this particular figure. This is Arjuna. Arjuna is in India as well here in the theater. It's a very important character. But what is so interesting in comparing both these theater traditions is that the myth and the content changes. At the origin, the big stories of these theaters come from India. It's the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. But over the centuries, these stories have been adapted to the Javanese context and culture. The characters changed, the stories changed, and I think it's quite fascinating to see this dynamics which come out of this new context and a new tradition, theater tradition. When I watched the videos and saw some women having their heads covered, I suddenly realized that the performances happen in an Islamic context, and that the players, the performers of this particular theater tradition are all Muslims. And I have to admit that I was completely unaware of this, and I realized that my perceptions of what Islam is in Indonesia are completely wrong, and that my understanding of what religion is in Southeast Asia is based on what you hear or get through the media. But it's the Islam practiced in Indonesia and in villages and cities, and the popular Islam in this region is very different from what I had in mind. And I found that very, very interesting. And in particular to imagine how these old Indian Hindu myths and traditions get reinterpreted and get a new form and a new content within a Muslim context. And I've found that really a very interesting story in itself. I think maybe the most interesting idea and message I want to share with you in the discussion we'll do later is this creativity and this amazing spirit of inventing new characters in this theater tradition. It's, as I said before, it's very lively, and it's something which changes. And Javanese shadow puppet theater, it's popular and is full of stories, little stories which are from our contemporary world. And there are new characters appearing on stage, like Lady Gaga and politicians. There are issues which are of our concern today, like COVID-19 and hygiene, and also ecology and our environment and the changing climate. All these themes and issues are they come on stage, and the storytellers, the dalangs, they use the old stories and make something meaningful, integrating all these new elements. And I think this mixture and this spirit of inventing new things and adopting to an older context and old stories and coming out with a new story, that's something I think it's really, really fascinating.
Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over to Manju, who will lead the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we begin, because we're all meeting in a virtual world, a small programming note. Panelists, in case my connection goes off and I disappear, please continue the conversation and I will find my way back to the discussion. So for the audience, I want to say that we're splitting this discussion today into two parts. In the first part, we'll go into detail about the artistry of this art form and really discuss the differences in characterizations, in tools between the Indian and the Indonesian version. And in the second half, we will try to explore what patronage means today. So I'd like to start, Johannes, with the discussion that we had right before we began. Talk us through what you were discussing earlier with us about the universality of shadow puppet theater and how it is a global technique, if you will.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to have this kind of virtual meeting in India and in Europe and Switzerland at the same time, and to have that together. I think this is something very new, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you for this opportunity. And I wouldn't have imagined this before COVID-19, that this is so easily, can easily be done. In preparing the talk this afternoon and our discussion, I just wanted to share with you that what I think needs to be highlighted here, that the feathered theater tradition, that's something universal and global. It's not something which we should reduce to India and Java and who influenced whom and who invented it first. According to what I could read and understand, it's that theaters are using shadow puppets. That's something very common from Egypt to Turkey, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, China, Thailand. So that's probably something which has been shared as a cultural practice over the centuries, and that's in artistic traditions which traveled across borders and continents through the ages, together with goods and stories and other things. But I think it's something we have to see really as something very global and universal.
So Paul, even when we think of shadow puppet theater in India, we tend to think of it as a monolithic art form, perhaps from the South. But actually, it's also hyper-localized in India itself, right? And even the source material is different in different parts. Can you sort of give us an overview of that?
Yeah, I mean, in India, Manju, the belief is, I mean, the closest we get to fact is the migration from Maharashtra. But if you actually read signals and between the lines elsewhere, it is supposed to be something that they say goes back even to the Indo-Greek times and came into India through Rajasthan and Gujarat. Where, Rajasthan, we have the kawad, which is also a similar kind of performance. But it's supposed to have, in recent times, originated out of Maharashtra, a place called Pinguli, and then moved down into Andhra and more popularized because of the Maratha invasions into the south. In fact, it went all the way to Tanjore, and then for a brief period of time, it was localized in Tanjore, and from there on spread out into the southern states of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra, and Orissa. What was fascinating, of course, was that in each of these places, the kind of storytelling, after all, it was actually a folklore tradition in some ways. Of course, embedded within it were the great epics and the Purans. from where most stories were taken, but there were stories drawn from local context. But even within that, what was fascinating was there was a huge level of localization in the Indian context. For example, in Andhra, it was based off the Ranganatha Ramayana. In Kerala, it's based off the Kamba Ramayana, which is Ramayana written by a Tamil poet. So, you know, there are different sources and therefore different nuances. In Andhra, it is a very itinerant tradition where people went from village to perform. In Kerala, it's a fixed location, typically in the premises of a temple, and there is no audience except goddess Kali, to whom the performance is being done, because she missed the action, the final stages of the battle between Ram and Ravan. So it's a tradition which doesn't have an audience except the goddess. So there are many different things about how, even within the Indian context, as it's spread across local geographies, it has assumed different shapes and forms and different storytelling styles.
In that Kerala version that you mentioned, does that mean that the version in Kerala is largely based on Ramayana stories only?
Yes, I mean, it has other stories too, but the primary story is typically a 21-day performance, which takes through the entire Ramayana, the version, of course, being the Kamba Ramayana.
So, which brings us to you, Eva. So the source material is largely the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the Indian mythology. But of course, it's traveled all over the world, and all over Southeast Asia, reached Indonesia, and even in Indonesia, there are different versions, right? So tell us about where, what is discussed as being sort of the origin story in Indonesia. And where it's thriving today.
Yes, I thought I might begin with the reminder of how the kingdoms changed from the Hindu kingdoms. They then became Muslim kingdoms, and during this transaction, it also changed the shadow puppetry. But while it was in the tradition, as we say, it's 2,000 years it's been in Java, which is quite a long time. And how I've understood my colleagues in Java, they say that while it was under the Hindu kingdoms, it was very exclusive. So it was actually played for the kingdoms themselves. It can be understood as something where you actually summon universal energy, and there's so much mythology you can actually connect with it. That's why I don't want to go into depth there. But the change was then when it became part of the Muslim kingdoms, because the Muslim kingdoms actually used it in order to speak about the religion. It became a lot more popular because it was brought to the everyday people of Java. So this is the big difference between in the transition period. And the stories that have been told are strongly from the Mahabharata at this point. I've understood because it is so much more dense. If you think about the Ramayana, like you mentioned in the film, that it's always the same story, right? It has the storyline and you tell the same story. But in the Mahabharata, because it is so dense, you can actually take just one episode of someone's life and then connect it to the everyday that is happening nowadays. And that is why Mahabharata really is very, very popular. So what they say is that you have like the stem stories where the information is fixed, and then you have the trunk stories, and the stem stories are those stories where the Dalang can tell his own interpretations and also speak freely. Actually, it's actually invented in the night and for that occasion.
So as Johannes was mentioning in the video, so there's actually a disconnection between, it's not looked upon as religious in any way. It's more cultural and communication. It's a communicated story.
I would say communication is a very big word, because obviously TV is something very new, and this is a tradition that's so much older. So it was to communicate information from far away. So it would, if the Sultan had something to discuss, then this is how the information would get to the people. Absolutely. And enjoyment, because the whole village would get together in order to also enjoy the evening. It would take 8 hours. It is very long. I'm sure it is like this in India too. I have Indian friends that have told me, yes, when the sun goes down, we can finally go outside because it's not so hot anymore. And this is the same case. So you see young children at 3 o'clock in the morning still listening to these shadow plays. So it is definitely a similarity in that aspect, that it is a different climate zone to our own.
So talking about the dalang, the puppeteer, who is the puppeteer in the Indonesian context? I mean, is he considered an artist? Is he an inheritor of the art? Does he create the puppets, like we saw in the Tholu Bommalaata example with Chidambra?
There might be examples of this, but if we are to take it back to the time when it was exclusive, because this is where the origin is more strongly coming from, he would be seen as someone that is more, I wouldn't say priest, but someone that is very, very important. So nowadays, they use the term mastermind, which just gives a hint of the fact that he has very much intonation. So he's a very philosophical person, because he doesn't only entertain, he obviously also informs and educates of righteous behavior in contrast to egoistic behavior, and things that it's always a central aspect, the ethics, and how to understand human behavior as something that really needs to be practiced and needs to be thought about. This is so the dalang is a very, very virtuous, very high person. I mean, highly situated person, actually has remained. So he does design his own puppets. This is true, but he will let them be created by someone else. So it is that the parchment is made by a parchment maker. He will then give the parchment to the puppet workshop, and here different people will be cutting them out. It depends where your virtue lies, actually, and this you will then perform.
But is it looked upon as a I guess a career? I mean, is that something? Can you choose to become a dalang?
Now I understand. It can be seen as a career, and it can be seen as a hobby. This really does depend. Yeah. If you have become very, very famous, then it is definitely a career. The famous dalang are incredibly wealthy people, because they will play very much and they will be sponsored, and so it is quite expensive to order famous dalangs. This is very true, and then he will be playing every night or every other night. So then it is a career. You can also study dalang at the moment, but the most respectable dalangs do come from a dalang family, because you will probably start playing your first puppets when you're age 4 or younger. So it really is something that you are connected your whole life with. It is a passion, a very strong passion. You can't separate passion and career. It is not something you do with your mind. It is your body, heart, and soul, most definitely.
Mm-hmm. So Paul, that's a big difference, right, with the way it is in India, with somebody like Chidambra, for instance. So can you look at or tell us about that contrast with the way, say, a troupe like Chidambra's deals with the craft here?
I think, the centrality of the dalang in the context of Javanese puppetry is probably, slightly different when you compare it with what it is in India. But when you look at somebody like Chidambra Rao, he's a very erudite person. He knows the epics, literally by heart. And his ability to interpret and to nuance the performance with, characterizations in the local context, etc., is amazing. So the difference lies, of course, in the fact that he's the master of everything. So he will actually make his own puppet. He can actually play during the performance. He can sing, he can play an instrument, and he also is someone who will actually make very specific interpretations on the night of the performance. So in that sense, I think there is some similarity in terms of, because he's a person you can have a long conversation about the epic, about the characters, about the nuances of those characters and things like that.
And he's the head of the troupe, right? And those are and their family members.
Yes, so he's the head of the troupe. Usually it's the core group is always the family, but occasionally they do bring in, people, but they're all from the local context. So they're people he calls upon whenever he needs. Sometimes there are restrictions on troupe size, etc., because budgets don't permit that. But when budgets do permit, the troupe becomes larger. But it's typically a 8 to 10 member, unlike in Indonesia, where it's a much larger group. Here, it's a much smaller group.
I'm curious, in both these traditions, are there people that are considered very good at playing particular characters, somebody who's great as Arjuna or somebody who's great as Karna? Maybe Eva, you can tell us first.
Yes, I would say that the distinction is a little bit different, but the Dalang are famous for different reasons. This is very true. So you will have some Dalang that are very virtuous in manipulating the puppets. The puppets are a lot smaller, as we will be seeing later on, and so it is actually the Dalang that plays the puppets. And so one will be very virtuous in moving them, in the movements and the fighting scenes, and another one might be very virtuous in creating the voices, because the voice of each puppet has a different tonality and everything. And then again, another Dalang might be very famous for his humoristic moments. So there are very many different aspects that the Dalang can be famous for, and the variety is large, I'm sure.
Paul, say an actor who's very good at playing or manipulating the Hanuman character, does somebody from the outside get called into play with a troupe?
No, actually, it's interesting because first of all, there is no gender consideration, because unlike the Dalang, who's the person manipulating and reciting, in this Tolu Bomalata tradition, the singers sit on a platform and are distinct from those who are manipulating the puppets behind the screen. Having said that, there are certain characters which the seniors will always handle and play. For example, one of the most sought after characters in terms of the seniority of who will manipulate that puppet is Hanuman. So because Hanuman has a very central role, especially in the context of the Ramayana, and playing Hanuman is a special a role that you get, because Hanuman in the context of the Ramayana and in the context of Tholu Bomalata is multifaceted. So you have Hanuman in many sizes, Hanuman in many contexts, and someone who's really able to manipulate the puppet suitably will be given that role.
So I was wondering, I mean, since for so many of us, seeing Tholu Bomalata for sure would be, an experience on YouTube mostly. I wondered if you could sort of create that scene for us of what a performance is like. I mean, anything that involves an all-nighter often involves, slight raucousness. So what is it like? How many people? And, is it held usually in the middle of the village? Or on a stage?
Tholu Bomalata is very much, until recently, of course. Now there are performances which are staged to larger audiences in a more contemporary context, but typically would be in the context of a village. So you would reach a village either at the invitation, or you land up there and then seek a patron. And once that is done, sometimes the performance can be a long 7-night performance. Nowadays, of course, because of the paucity of time, patronage, patience, everything, it's usually a single night performance. And the way it happens is that there is a stage that is set up. In the old days, it was literally oil lamps that were placed behind the stage. Then, of course, it became Petromax lamps. And now, of course, it's bright neon lights. but there is a stage and the people are at the back of the screen, the people who manipulate the puppets, and they have the puppets kept beside them. A typical night would involve as many as 40 to 50 characters. And so therefore, you have to be really deft at managing that. And then what happens is that the show commences post-dinner, everyone settles down, and it's typically in the open, in the village square. And the performance goes on, and every now and then there is a little bit of an intermission when the sensing is that interest is flagging or there's need to stop and interject with some fun and humor, and sometimes even rather raunchy scenes, because there are jester characters which are there specifically for that role, where they will actually have very crude, lewd scenes, sometimes even scenes like a rape and things like that. That just, is a titillation primarily to just get everyone all awake again and anticipation. But there is also an intermission in that sense for the puppeteer to pass on any messages he or she would like to pass on, because the jester in some ways is an alter ego of the puppeteer. In the Kannada tradition, actually, when the jester puppet is made, they take a tuft of their hair and stick it on top of the jester as a replica of themselves. And so that's the character that they step into as an alter ego. And then they talk about learnings, they talk about lessons, they pull some local politician's leg, they will do all kinds of stuff. And when government sponsorship was there, they would talk about health issues, small family issues, cleanliness, those kind of things.
Eva.
Finish at dawn, literally you'd finish at dawn.
But these days, how long does it? Is what, 8 hours,
well,
4 hours?
Yeah, you start at about anywhere at 9, 10, and you'll be done by about 4, 5.
Okay. Eva, but the troupe in the case of Vayankulit is much larger, right?
Yes, this is true. So we might only have one puppeteer to manipulate the puppets.
All the characters.
All of the characters, yes. But the gamelan orchestra, for example, that will be a minimum of 20 people. It can be smaller, but in usually the traditional orchestra is very, very big. And you have 4 to 8 singers also to accompany. So they're singing old Javanese poems and songs. But I would like to mention that what Paul has just mentioned, there are very many similarities, especially for the interim sections where where you can address and speak as your own individual. Everything you said actually can be put one-to-one, copied onto Vayankulit. But the scenery, if I'm allowed to describe, there's usually a very big platform in front of the houses. So if a puppeteer is giving a performance in the village, then maybe a tent will be put up. I've once experienced one where it was in front of the cemetery. So everyone would gather in quite close to the screen. But if the sponsor is the city or a big bank, then there will be a lot of space. It might be in front of the city hall, for example. And nowadays you also have screens to project it. It is obviously also always streamed on YouTube. Always streamed on YouTube also, and calling in everyone. So it is so loud that everyone can actually come and hear it close by. And then it begins also at about 8, 9 o'clock, and it's divided up into 3 sections. So in the beginning, the problem will be discussed. That is now to be maybe some king wants to marry some daughter of another king, and the daughter doesn't want to. And then all of the different the 2 sides, right? It's always the left sides, either the Pandawa and the Kaurawa, and if it's not them, then are the different 2 left and right sides. And this will be discussed in the kingdoms. Maybe there will be an audition and all that. And that will take quite a long time. Then there's an intersection, and then the first fighting scenes will start, and like the first conflicts will come upon each other. And then there's another interim section, and then in the end, the solution. And this also happens, also will continue until 3 in the morning. And in the interim sections, they've become very popular, and they are becoming longer and longer. You will have maybe a singer performing, or comedian coming on stage, or the people that have been sponsored, they will be interviewed on stage. So this interview section is used for a lot of things, and the puppeteer might add in with the jester puppets into the dialogue, or might not, but this is definitely becoming very popular, the interim section. But the puppeteer is always sitting facing the screen, so there are certain things that are always the same. He does not move away. He's always facing the screen, and he has someone behind him to prepare the puppets, because obviously they change, the characters change. So he will be preparing them behind him and laying them down on his right side for him to play. So you need an assistant.
What about the music? I mean, how often does the music of one performance change, or does the dalang sort of decide what the music should be for each one?
This is something that Europeans, there are many, not only Europeans, also obviously also many Americans that are very fascinated by this aspect, actually, because the dalang obviously cannot speak to the musicians, and he has a little an instrument, or a little that peg that he knocks against the this box where the puppets were in next to him, and this already gives some indication. It indicates to the orchestra the speed of the next piece, also which piece it will be, because there's a certain piece for a love scene, there's a certain piece for a fighting scene, but in the fighting scenes it's just incredible because they are percussioned, and they will be percussioned in the exact right moment when he is now doing this bam and everything, and it's so difficult to understand how they, but obviously it's a symbiosis, because also the musicians, they started when they were young, and so the connection between everyone is so strong that you can't compare it with an orchestra by us, where you first learn the notes and then you get together, and no, there it's always, you don't rehearse this, it's always connected. So it's very, very special. Also that is why the audience loves it so much, because they can actually connect in with the music, they connect to this whole symbiosis that is happening in front of them. It's very, very emotional in a nice way. You feel embraced, actually.
But in the case of Tholu, Paul, are these old songs? But Chidambra is also composes his own music, right?
Yeah.
So it's.
So, typically in contemporary performances where they're performing the epics, anyway, you can't perform the whole show. So you will pick up pieces from the epics. So whether it is, Bali Vadham, where, Bali is being destroyed, or it is Lakshmana Murcha, where Lakshman is, passes out literally, and Hanuman has to fetch, Sanjeevani Booty, and he brings the whole mountain. Or there are some very interesting scenes like the Matsya Vallabha, where Hanuman crosses the Park Strait to get to Sri Lanka, and he's sweating, and a couple of drops of sweat fall into the sea, and there's a mermaid, and she swallows one drop that impregnates her, and she has a child, and that guy is actually on the other side. And when Lakshmana is taken to Patal Lok, Hanuman goes to rescue him, and he defeats all the others there, however powerful, but he meets his match in this Matsya Vallabha. And then he's puzzled, and he asks, who are you? And then the story is told of him actually being Hanuman's son. So, those are the kind of sections they'll pick up, which have, interests, and then also will draw a couple of lessons from there. And the stanzas or the kandas that will be sung will be from the epic.
Okay. So we've discussed the puppets so much that we have to, we're going to pull up a slide now, which is Karna, I believe, that we're going to be looking at. Yeah, there you go. So what, there we are. Okay, so I wanted to sort of look at the colors and features of each of these. Paul, there's so much detail and specificity to the color scheme that's used, even though it's shadow theater, the colors have a great deal of significance, right? So looking at this example and also looking at the general example, say Hanuman's coloring, Krishna's coloring, could you tell us what the significance is of these colors?
Well, typically, see, first of all, colors in the Indian context are drawn from Natya Shastra, where every rasa, every feeling is emoted and attached to a color. So Raudram, where you are angry and in battle and all, it's red, depicted by red. Interestingly, if there is, the specific character like Ram, they will be shown in a blue because they are all avatars of Vishnu. And similarly, Hanuman, who is Anjaneya, will be painted in green. So there are some significance to the color. However, in the Andhra tradition, for the most part, red, black, and white are the dominant colors. Characters will be painted yellow, characters will be painted blue for a variety of reasons. Some of the royal ones will be painted yellow to show that. But there is also the other bits of, for example, the eyes. The eyes will be round and angry, depending on which side of the divide you are. Most of the characters on the good side usually will have more narrow eyes. Those on the angry or the opposing side will have very round, powerful eyes to demonstrate either the demonic character in them or the anger in them.
Eva, can you lead us through how to see Karna in the Javanese example?
Certainly. Well, Karna is definitely a very interesting figure because he does belong to the Kaurava side because of his destiny, and nonetheless, in this figure, he is depicted as a noble person, as a noble character, which he is. That is why his destiny is so sad, and that's in that sense, right? So he is very loyal, and you can see his loyalty within this positive character trait. His narrow waist, the parallel legs that are standing there, his narrow eyes and pointy noses, which is an interesting aspect that also is in this which is also a sign for a noble character. And his that his mouth is closed. So Dursasana, for example, has a very open mouth and a big round nose, and not round, but it's actually it's already a little bit more vulgar looking, like his character. And this is depicted here, that he is a wonderful kshatriya, and unfortunately he is fighting for the wrong side. So his loyalty is going to the wrong side, and that's why it's debated a lot about him. Something he actually shares with the puppet of Krishna is the angle of his forehead. So his face is pointing straight. Now Arjuna and Yudhishthira, they will have their forehead pointing down. We'll see that in the figure of Arjuna, which is obviously a very, very humble sign. So from Karna, in his character and the way he speaks, and you just mentioned anger is part of his of how he acts. That is probably why his nose is painting forward. So he will speak loudly, not loudly, but he might be angry. It could be angry, but anger is also in red in the Wayankulit. So he is not anger is not something that one can read off this character. It will be in other characters really have red faces, like Baladeva, the brother of Krishna. He is painted red. He apparently cannot keep his anger to himself, so he cannot control his emotions. So colors are actually quite black, for example, will be a sign. If a character has a black face, like Krishna does, it will be a sign that he can control his emotions, that he has already practiced to be human in a higher level.
Could we pull up the Arjuna slide? Okay. Mm-hmm. So here Arjuna's got a black face as well, right?
Precisely, yes. And here we see how his forehead is pointing down, and he wears no jewelry, so he's of very humble nature, with his brother Yudhishthira as well.
And could we just discuss the Eva? Maybe you could discuss the sizing. I mean, look at the big difference, and the Javanese puppets are rather smaller.
Yeah, I think this slide depicts very nicely that why the puppeteer in Java can manipulate the figures on his own because of the size. So it is not heavy at all. Obviously, skin is not a heavy material, but the legs don't move, as we can see that. The legs and the arms. So you obviously need about 3 people to manipulate a big puppet in comparison to a small puppet like that.
But that also affects the material and the production, right? You had discussed earlier about the hide.
True. Yes. Well, from what I've understood, and I've also seen, obviously, Indian puppets, that there is still more of the hair layer is still on it, so they are much thicker than the Indonesian puppets, which can be very, very thin. Chinese puppets too are very, very thin. They're also translucent, but very, very thin. So you can, there are different nuances. The bigger the puppet gets, I would say that a large puppet in Indonesia might be about 1 meter. So it might go up to just under the shoulders of this Arjuna here, and which is still small in comparison. So you still can carry it with one hand.
Paul, do you want to just, point out the features that we should be looking at in this Arjuna
so
figure?
basically, I think, in the Tholu tradition, there are characters who are specific for the moment. Like, for example, Hanuman, when he goes to, Sri Lanka and he meets with Sita, he goes initially in a very dwarf version of himself. And then, she's not particularly convinced about who he is and was a little doubtful. And that's when he, he takes his Vishwarupa, which is, the cosmic form, and he becomes a gigantic shape. And they actually have these 2 different shapes. So, for example, we have a Hanuman in our collection, which is just under 7 feet. So, you will show that. But in the tradition, you'll also have things like when Ram, Lakshman, and Sita are in the jungle during their exile versus when they're returning to Ayodhya in their regal version. So there will be one which will be very beautifully decorated, embellished with a lot of jewelry, and there are crowns and all of that. And the Aranya, the forest version is literally with the hair tied on top of the head and with very basic clothing and no jewelry and things like that. So it's all contextual. And Andhra tradition specifically, Tolu Bomalata specifically, has large size puppets. But if you go to Karnataka, the puppets shrink quite dramatically, and they will be somewhat similar to the Vayang traditions, probably under 2 feet or there.
Johannes, in the collection that you're featuring, how big is that collection, and how, especially in the exhibition, how many pieces do you have, and what's the sort of the breadth of characters that you've got?
Look, I think it is limited and restricted in numbers. It's not a complete set. It's a selection of objects and a selection of characters, and we don't have we had to borrow objects from another museum to complete our story. So we asked for loans to the Ethnographic Museum of Zurich so that we could complete the setting and the scenery, because the entire collection is not so big. No, I think it's, Eva, you might correct me, it's in 40 or 46, 50 objects. Sorry, I can't remember exactly. But so it's not a complete set. It's it's a selection. But this is, I think, also due to the spirit and the taste of the collector, who had access to certain figures and characters he liked, and he was not a systematic anthropologist who completed entire sets of puppets and systematically wanted to have the complete picture of everything.
So this is a question that perhaps each of you can take separately, but when you are collecting these puppets, can you collect different versions of the same character, or are there that many dissimilarities between them that make it interesting?
Well,
Eva, sorry.
Yes, actually in Java, there are different, there were different kingdoms. So I'll just name three. There was in Cirebon, Surakarta, and Yogyakarta, and they each had their own style design. So if we have a puppet from the three different, they will have a different character. So the local area will actually have their character, have a bit of their own character. It was once asked, yeah, in Bandung, for example, is another area where it can be. We want to have Arjuna have his head a little bit higher or something because we're cheeky over here. So they actually do that. But otherwise, it's in the traditionally old ones, you definitely have the East and the West. You can't really pinpoint it completely for every figure, but it is the case.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge variety and a huge variety of characters. In fact, it's not just, human characters and divine characters. It's also animals. It's also plants and trees, which are part of the performance. So you could end up collecting, a set of 300 if you wanted. And then, of course, it's also age, right? Today, what Chidambara Rao will do will look quite different from what, say, his parents did, because the colors that were used, the stylization, some of those things are also very different. In fact, some of the older ones I like, but they are very stark and rustic, but I really love them, Some of the more contemporary ones are exquisite, the work is just. And I think that's partly also the shift that's happening. In those days, this was purely a tool of the trade. It was what you took with you when you went to perform village to village. Today, some of this is also a work of art, which you sell as a work of art. And therefore, you invest that much more in making it an exquisite, a beautiful piece.
Which brings us really to that question of, that discussion about patronage, which traditionally for art forms in India were all from, all with royalty, but obviously things have changed now. Paul, I was wondering, how do you see your role as a collector patron? And do you feel, you mentioned in the video as well about the conundrum that's facing people like Chidambara. And so how do you see a sort of a responsibility that comes as part of the collecting process?
Well, yes, certainly, because I think, these are just amazing art forms. They are so comprehensive because they're not just two-dimensional works of art that you stick up on a wall. It's a life for people like Chidambara Rao. It's his life, right? Having said that, I think patronage has shifted over the years. There are in the records stories of royal patrons who actually gave tax revenues of multiple villages to performers who they got excited about and whose performance they loved. And then, of course, it became an itinerant tradition where people were going village to village and getting paid either in cash or in kind, sometimes paid with grain, paid with clothes and things like that. I think in the 70s and 80s, the government of India started to provide some patronage because they found this an excellent way to communicate to the rural audiences. So, many social programs were driven through the medium of these performances. And, today where we are is, it's a bit of a mix of the performance as a source of engagement and income, as well as the actual puppets, which people buy for the sheer beauty of those objects, And so some of it they have in the, cane box, which is now, of course, replaced by a large aluminum trunk. But you could, potentially the family could have as many as 250 to 300 characters always available, because then they choose between that to take depending on the day.
Johannes, on the Rietberg website, I mean, one of the very interesting things was this video that you had talking to young people about wayang kulit. And there was this sense that they were watching it, they were in, it was something that was part of their lives. And in India, this is a very, it's a very different situation.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you guys did that, and also how effective a cultural export wayang kulit has been?
The series of small movies to start with, that's something which we thought we should do since COVID-19 came, and all our plans to invite some performers to Zurich, all these plans we had to abandon, and there was no point of bringing artists to our museum. So we thought, what can we do to enter in a dialogue with the performers, with people from Indonesia? What kind of cooperation can we start to have an exchange? And so we had this idea of asking friends and partners and assistants with whom Eva had worked in Indonesia before, to do a series of small documentary films and movies for us about different aspects, about dalangs and young people, etc. And I think this was where it's a very nice project, and I'm very happy that we soon will launch the third film, and there will be 5 in the end. But let me point out, and coming back to the question about about patronage, and I think a big difference between these two theater traditions is the fact that in Java and Indonesia, and Eva might correct me, this theater tradition have a very strong royal support, and it became part of the court culture. So the standing and the status related to this performing art, I think it's different from what I see now, and you might correct me, Paul, in India. So what I receive here, it's the shadow theater is something more rustic, still village oriented, folkloristic in a sense, while wayang kulit in Indonesia has become part of their national cultural identity. And you see that everywhere. When you, on websites, wayang kulit, and the self-presentation of the government of what is Indonesian culture, this shadow puppet theater is omnipresent. It's there, and people are proud of it. And it goes from, politicians who identify with certain characters in these plays. It's the youth who talks about it, and young people who love to see this theater and love to transform it and innovate, and it's part of their daily popular culture. You have seen the video. So I think the status also of the performers is very different. You know, you can be a star, someone very of high esteem and respect in Indonesia. You can earn good money if you are a good performer, and you have this, you know, reputation and fame. Well, I think what I see from or what I remember from seeing puppeteers and people performing in India, it is that's a different setting, you know, and it's more, they need the sponsors, the patrons to perform, and it's not of high status, you know. And there might also be another aspect to it. Just, I mean, that's, I have just, it came to my mind, but the context of making puppets, working with leather, you know, there are certain taboos related to music, tanning, leather work, and working with this kind of material, which might not be a problem in Indonesia, but this might cause some questions in a caste society in a different context, you know, where in the past working with leather and these things were considered not to be, you know, occupations of high status. So I think that there might, the setting seems to me very different, and the patronage related to it.
When collectors buy wayang kulit puppets, are they buying vintage puppets? Are they buying new ones? Are these available? I mean, in India, one of the things that has happened, as Paul mentioned, is that Tolu Bomalata puppets, for instance, are now widely available in craft exhibitions. And even people like interior designers are now using them in spatial design. Wayang kulit puppets, are they widely available, or when a collector is purchasing it, is he buying it from a troupe?
Eva, you might reply to this.
Well, there are different qualities of wayang kulit puppets. So because of their popularity as a symbol of Indonesia, they have become touristic. You can buy them touristically. If you go to the Sultan and think, you can buy a puppet there, right? But the puppets that are of interest in Europe, they are definitely were played with, for example. So they many of the collections are from the middle of the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, and so forth. So we have also the ones that we are showing, they're all 100 and 150 years old. That's why the gold that is used, which is one indication for the fact that it is of Sultan quality, or of the tradition as such. It has become very nicely aged, for example. So these are aspects that collectors in Europe and abroad obviously cherish. We cherish when something has age. But in Indonesia, we still they're still very virtuously made, and therefore buying a new puppet is still an investment. You can't get it for it's still quite a lot. Yeah, it's still expensive.
Okay.
And
so sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. I'm sure it depends on the collector. There's another form of collecting also, the daggers that come from Indonesia, the kri. These also, some collectors will want the new ones, and some collectors will embrace the old ones. It really depends how it has aged and if it is still complete. Because if the form, which is so incredibly important, if that has been, if that is lost, then the value of the puppet will also go down.
Okay, so we have two questions that we need to get to. Perhaps we've answered some parts of it, but I'm just going to read out one that's come in. I think this is for you, Johannes. Dipinder Randava, he says, I was struck by Johannes's observations on the syncretic origins of puppet theatre and its earlier practice in South India. Does that tradition still carry over into current times, perhaps into themes that could be interpolated from the Mahabharata? And is wayang also used as a medium to communicate social messages, perhaps through allegories? And if so, who deploys Wayang performances for this purpose? I think we've discussed it into some. Yeah, I think we've discussed that. But
I mean, Eva will complete this, and I think we said that already, that there are new elements of and new themes which have become now part of performances, and they are invented new stories, and it's about religious tolerance in Indonesia and the coexistence of different religions we saw, and ecological issues. So these themes enter performances and have become part of this tradition, right? Eva, you might comment on that.
Yes, that is true. I guess, I mean, when we had a webinar last week with an Indonesian audience, and they also asked, why are the stories still, they're old stories, how can they still be interesting? Because not everyone is acquainted with the stories. They know the characters, but there's a difference if you know the characters and if you actually know all of the stories. They do need to be told. And so the head of an institution there just said, well, it's obviously it can be retold because the central core also of the Mahabharata, I mean, of all the stories, is an ethical issue. So these ethics, they don't change because it's the core. The core is on ethical issues, and the contemporary subjects, they will fall on these grounds that are timeless. You can't really philosophy you don't write new philosophy. You just rediscover old philosophy, which is also in call it.
And what is good behavior? What is good action? What is your destiny in life? How do you behave with your people you're surrounded by? These are questions which are eternal, and they are as contemporary and modern as they are. I mean, we can go on for that forever, I think.
Consequences of our actions, I think, is one.
Exactly.
And these discussions, do they come through the characters like the Semar, the character of the Semar, or are they new characters that?
Yes, Semar is an interesting character because he is wise. He's incredibly wise. So he's actually wiser than the figure of Krishna, and so he will explain to his he will explain why something has gone wrong, and he will advise what to do differently. So he is definitely someone that can transport this kind of information. Absolutely.
Paul, do you want to also talk about the Bangaraka character here?
Yeah. So in Tolu Bomalata, there are jester characters, and like I told you earlier, they provide, they have few very important roles. One is they are an alter ego in some senses of the key performer, and the messages they want to give usually are given through the medium of the jester character. The jester character also happens to be the comic relief during the performance. So here you have on your screen Semar on the left and Bangaraka on the right. In the Andhra tradition, of course, Bangaraka is somewhat multifaceted. She has a kinder side, but typically is a gossip, and is also rather raunchy with all kinds of shenanigans all the time. I think the difference to some extent is there's in Indonesia, from what I understood from Eva, for example, is there are two layers to this, broadly speaking. One is the layer of some of the very senior quasi-divine characters like Semar, who have powers of advice which are way beyond what even someone like Krishna, who's actually the advisor in chief of our epics, right? But in the Tolu tradition, of course, Bangaraka actually is not got anything divine, is very, very rustic, but has a multifaceted role to play. Has a nice side, has a side which is not that pleasant, and can be quite a mean character when she wants to be. In fact, in the Karnataka tradition, she's even more mean, and actually is never shown anywhere even as half nice as she is shown in the Andhra tradition.
So we have one question from YouTube. Maybe Eva or Johannes, you could answer this one. What are the main differences between Javanese shadow puppetry performance and Balinese puppetry performance? Are characters the same or different?
I would like to let Eva answer this question.
Eva, should I repeat the?
The difference between Javanese and Balinese shadow puppets.
There is an amazingly large difference. So we can't show Balinese puppets at the moment, which is, the comparison might make also more sense because of the Hindu tradition in Bali, exactly. Their aesthetics is completely different. Please excuse me for a moment. And it is also much more real, there are much more rituals involved. Paul mentioned earlier on that some performances will be played without an audience in Bali. That will definitely happen. You also have performances that happen during the day, so the shadow is not even seen. So in Bali, there's really quite a big difference. You will hear the music and you will hear the voices, but it doesn't need to address an audience.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. But it will be with the rituals. I have not been in Bali, but I've heard that there are ceremonies happening during the day constantly. And these ceremonies will be, I'm not sure of every ceremony, but many of these ceremonies will be accompanied with wayang kulit. Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Thank you very much. Those are the only questions that we have, and we have now gone half an hour over the time that we were allotted. So thank you so much. Avehi, do you want to come back in? Are you here? There she is.
Yes, I am. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us. But thank you to these panelists for spending time and for this great conversation. It was fascinating. So thank you for joining us, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Good night from India.
Yeah, good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Manju. Thank you.